So thank you, Michael, for your kind words and for the invitation to Ohio and to give me the chance to visit the Wexner Center and see Chef again. Let me just set up. So please let me know if you don't hear me or if I'm just too loud or my English, Spanglish is a little bit incomprehensible. So what I wanted to do was that I wanted to start the presentation with a few slides that somehow try to frame the work or understand the work, as not only for you, but also for me as a testing ground of how I can articulate the work that is being done, kind of stopping and then looking back to sort of continue developing some of the projects. So the lecture, its name is also pretty, and it's in a way related to the type of work that you're going to see. I think that it somehow lingers within a realm that is neither pretty, neither beautiful, nor ugly. So I think the pretty is more of a friendly term for kind of the type of representation. Chef would call them the cute. So I just give him another version, which is the pretty, to that. So I organized the lecture in 3 chapters or 3 zones, let's say. This a little bit like a book. So the first chapter is trying to kind of question what is the pretty actually. So the first chapter is what I call the affair of the pretty. The second one is a theory of the pretty. And the last one is the visual of the pretty, which is the actual work. So for me, the affair of the pretty, or actually the contemporary architecture affair would be the surface. I think that the affair of the surface actually started a little bit earlier. The kind of the detachment of the surface to the body of the building, I think, started with some of the questions presented by Venturi and Scott Brown in the Learning from Las Vegas book, where they identify a separation between the body, the architectural body and the surface of that architectural body. So the kind of A and B of the decorated shed, the decoration and the shed, instead of being 2 separate entities, they somehow collapse into one. So in that small diagram where the shed has a facade, let's say a surface facade that is very exchangeable. So the shed always becomes a kind of genetic form, and then that surface becomes independent. So what I call this, the beginning of the affair is that when the surface became independent. So I did a little bit of a diagram. Again, a little bit to clarify the evolution of that affair and where I think that the discipline is moving towards, or the new things that I find interesting in some of the elements of the discipline. So there's 5 categories, and you will see that there's a diagram, then there's some architectural example and an art example that somehow try to question the evolution of, the evolution of the surface. So the first one it would be the surface as shed. So following the kind of decorated shed ambition, what you see is that in that case, it's still very much within the architectural realm. The shed or that first phase, it's literally a facade. It's an applied facade. I mean, the volume is separated from that facade, but there's an emphasis on that phase. And I think an evolution of that from a 2D single frontal representation, as the Venturi and Scott Brown, I think that Herzog and de Meuron do an evolution of that decorated shed. They linger within the representation of that skin, but in this case, the imagery that is applied as a series of materials effects they have no meaning. So if the previous one, the meaning of the shed had to do with a notion of program representation, or there's a big ad in the surface and so on. In this case, there's no representation of program, there's no expression of any kind, but actually there's a kind of material material research or material investigation. So in their case, images become textures. And you see that in the case of Shashoi Kusama, where she's trying to erase any figuration, and everything becomes background. There's no figure on ground. Everything, by using the dot pattern, which is a very genetic pattern or material or image, she starts to erase any contours or any objects. In that installation, the inflatable objects somehow linger in the space, and they are absorbed by the wall behind. The next iteration is the surface fold. And the surface fold, here there's an example of Eisenman from the Church of the Year 2000. I think that what happens there is that the fact that the triangulation works as if before in the first shed, there was a facade. In this case, the facade is not as such. I mean, you still have contours, so the facade starts to shift. So the facade becomes a little bit of the roof. The triangulation allows for a folding of that facade. So the facade is a little bit on the front or a little bit on the side. And I think that for that is relevant, the work of Bacon, mostly because what you see is that you see the figure of the face, but then you see how the face is shifting. So the ear is in the face, the ear shifts to the front a little bit, and the mouth moves to the right. So that shifting of the elevations or the surfaces of the building, I think it's an important transformation of the fold. The third iteration, it's the surface soft. So I think what is interesting from the surface soft is that it's what I call the degree zero architecture. I mean, in the soft version, what Greg Lynn would call the blob, I think that what happens is that there's no more references. I mean, you cannot recognize any facade. You cannot recognize an elevation or a roof. Even the landscape is engulfed in that surface. So the fold, it's bringing architecture to zero. I mean, you don't have architectural representations that can actually give you answer for how you can, figure out what are the tectonic elements. And I think that the embryo house, again by Greg Lynn, is an interesting example of that, because what he is trying to devise is that in the embryo houses is not only the topological transformations of a geometry, but also how you can open windows on a surface. So how you open windows not in a traditional way, so you don't have contours, you don't have edges, you don't have frames. I mean, all of that had disappeared. So in the case of the soft, you see that the windows are cut. And in that case, you start to see they almost cut as gills in fishes. I mean, there's a reference to biology, or there's a reference to other disciplines to start to figure out ways in which you can bring architecture back into geometry. The next is the surface thick. So once the surface had no more coating, I mean, there's no more coating, there's no architectural coating. Also the previous surface soft had no thickness. So it's any of the drawings that came with the use of digital technology gave you a zero thickness. So how you can start to give it not only some architectural elements such as windows and doors and openings, but also how you can start to give it architectural qualities such as materiality and structure. So the surface thick starts to achieve some level, some capacity of kind of architectural integrity, let's say, by getting subdivided, structurally, they can become efficient as structure and so on. So I think that the work of Reiser Uemoto is interesting. In this case, the Shenzhen Bay International Airport, where you see how the surface, the holes appears in the surface. So they're not actually, they're windows. They are between structures and openings, windows and structures and so on. And again, the reference to systems that somehow give you grains and give you gradients as the openings become as gradients, and no, they're not that feature. So there's still no figuration within any of those surfaces. The last iteration is what I call the surface pop. So I think instead of trying to, in the last two iterations, instead of trying to devise a way in which architecture can measure itself again, can reinvent some elements, the openings or the structures, how you make a new vocabulary for architecture, for a new type of surface and morphology, how you can start to bring some of those elements that we have, that appear in the first two diagrams. So the surface pop starts to look at other conditions. So those conditions is what I call the theory of the pretty, which is the surface pop, or what is compound tectonics, kind of more complex tectonics. So a move from not only surface topology, but also from surface, kind of structuring the surface. But the first thing is that the idea that we can look back at the surface as a mass. So instead of the surface being this laminar film or this laminar skin, we can look at a building as a mass that can have a kind of negative, positive cutout. In this case, the rectangle shot by Hans Hollein, I think, is an interesting example of how clearly you see the division between, a mass that has thickness. The next stage is how we can, these are elements, how these elements can start to play down into an architecture that can start to gather, new complexities, and a little bit of a kind of hybridization of architecture, where you don't have a single system or a single gradient that is applied to a surface, and that gradient becomes structure and windows and so on, which is the result of the continuous surface, either by scripting on a surface and getting a lot of results in terms of how it's articulated, that surface. But instead, the complexity of the hybridization of multiple systems. I think what I find very interesting in this chef sculpture is that you can clearly see the intersection of two systems that they cannot negotiate. So there's a kind of disguise in how an inflatable could actually intersect into a beam or a metal beam. So, it cannot be an inflatable. And the other thing is that you start to see the issue, what I call the illustration, is that the surface, the idea that an inflatable would have a surface coating or like an image coating, and he's transferring the coating from a real inflatable to a fake one, which is these two walrus that are intersecting a second object. So they're not only intersecting between each other, but actually they're intersecting a secondary system. Then an architecture of an awkwardness. So this is Piet Bloem, taken from the Charles Schenk's book on architecture today. But I think that there's something about the imbalance. Architecture, also the surface paradigm, abuse so much the relationship between the planes and the object, where surface landscape becomes object. So the independence of the object and the separation of the object to the landscape, I think, is an interesting condition of how you can start to look at volume. So that's what I call the awkwardness of the surface. And then a little bit of reference, and this is not a very good image, but maybe you can see this is an octopus by Tim Hawkinson. And the notion of disguise, I think that the biology model has been used very much in architecture in a very literal way. I think that architecture needed the references of biology to really improve and expand the vocabulary, the architectural vocabulary. So architecture didn't need to look at the past to kind of expand the vocabulary, but actually look at another discipline. But what I think is interesting from this Tim Hawkinson is that this is not an octopus. Each one of the suckers is a picture of his lips sucking onto a glass, and then the rest is the octopus is like a hand, as an expansion of the hand. So it's a kind of fake octopus. So the disguise, that idea of the disguise of the image on relationship to the, its topic. So not that all of these issues are gathered within the visual of the pretties, because sometimes it's tangential, sometimes it's more direct, sometimes it's, so I just wanted to set up a kind of the category of the work itself. So instead of setting them up in typologies nor categories and so on, I just wanted to group them with almost with like personalities. So how can you start, and this is like looking back at the work and not starting the work thinking within these terms, but I think that in a way they reflect the work, almost as if each project has a particular character related to a personality. So the three characters are the suave, the eccentric, and the gang. Each one of them has a particular condition in terms of how they formally work and how and the character that they achieve. So the first one, it's what I call the suave. And I think that the suave relates more to the kind of the typology of, or the type of work that it's more connected to systems that are more soft, or systems that are more repetitive, or systems that work with textiles, or with textures, or gradients. So the model of the gradient that I was mentioning before that really create a distribution, an equal distribution of geometry within a surface. So the first project that relates to that topic, it was an installation for the gallery in SCI-Arc. So SCI-Arc has a program where it presents original work from different architects, and the idea is that you test architecture within the constraints of the gallery space. So for me, what was interesting is that how you can start to see with this notion of disguise, how you can start to look at an artificial landscape within an indoor space. So it's almost as if you bring a garden onto a gallery space, but the garden doesn't try to mimic the actual nature, but it's highly artificial. So the kind of Versailles-like plant arrangement or the meandering walkways, it all tries to recreate that notion of a landscape, but treating it slightly different. So the texture or the kind of material proficiency, like working, in this case, because of budget or because of material interest of working with plastic, which is the kind of highly artificial material. The idea is that you start to find what I call the material disguise. I mean, plastic is very flimsy. This is a very thin plastic, 0.3 PET sheet, and it's laminated with pink vinyl. And so the plastic, by kind of sinking through a corrugation system, the plastic becomes more structural. So that's why the name also they work as tendrils. But the idea is that even though working with a corrugation that gives you a genetic pattern, bringing some figuration, which are these corals. And the corals are not only working as kind of figures in the ground, but also they're working as structural, like curling them allows them to stand up to 8 feet in the biggest one. And then the same plastic, it's used in the landscape, in the floor. This work is done also with a huge group of students in the school. It's part of a kind of program that engages architects and students. And the main device, it's a pin, like a small screw. So again, curvature and figuration helps in the structure, but it's, it's also part of the kind of the narrative of that space. A later project that it was similar in terms of like how you can use the same technique and revisit it was for an exhibition of the French culture, the French influence into Los Angeles, the earlier French immigrants. And so the idea was the gallery had no walls, is how you create partitions or gallery partitions to set up or to present the work. So in this case, the same effect of that surface, of that thin surface, by changing the kind of articulation or by changing the geometry would give you multiple possibilities of you know, kind of structure. So it doesn't have a secondary structure. The whole scene becomes a kind of corrugated mass. So few of them, and then the curators, they selected images and then printed the images on the final layer of the plastic. So there was, everything is embedded within that surface lamination. Another project that is more current, I'm not going very much sequentially in terms of dates, so the project somehow jumps. I wanted to kind of group them within these personalities or categories. So the next project is for a kindergarten in Santa Monica. And the idea was to visit or to dress a surface of a wall. So in this case, the only material that it's the one that is proliferated, and then the objects or the kind of more figural forms come in front of that texture, that swave material, let's say. But the idea is that this shingle wall will get overlaid with some of these other figures. So we have terrariums and different activities for the kids to use. But that same idea of that, the idea that there's a texturing device that can give you a new ground or can give you a new kind of background, but always opposing that to a kind of a cutout or like a 2D figure in front. So the background, in a way, becomes you know, kind of a new landscape, a new vertical landscape. These are just some of the drawings and the models, and the few iterations of how the doubling of the background to the front could work in relationship to the program that goes along the school. The next project, so much of the work that you will see that it really shifts from being very, from work being installation to later on you're going to see some examples that are large scale, so not everything stays in the small scale, and sometimes being really small scale. These are some jewelry pieces for an exhibition in Italy, Oro d'Autore, and I think that what happens is that I think this relates even more, this is an older project, but it really relates more to that paradigm that I call the one that where you have more holes instead of windows, you know, like how you can treat a surface and how you can create a kind of a series of openings that do go along with that topology. So there's no secondary system that tries to intersect this surface. Actually, everything happens within that single topology. These are new, this is a new line of rings. And in the new, you know, the new iterations, you see a little bit more clear like how there's an aim for the notion of volume or intersection. So instead of being one single surface trying to do everything from openings to curvature to, instead there's few more elements. So these edges that I call like the cornices of the, so we bring back objects that intersect and cornices, some elements that are architectural, so even though this is just a ring. So here are just few options, but that, you know, again, in the swave also the notion of repetition. Repetition becomes a way of producing the effect of the kind of texture effect, but repetition is like, in this case, they're all very similar. This is a current project for a commission for a toddler tableware, where I think that some of the elements that in this case, I mean, or the utensils or the plates, they try to move away from keeping that single surface. I mean, it's still within the morphology of a topological surface that is quite smooth, but then start to recognize other elements. So in this case, you can see where you hold or the handle. These are all plastic utensils, but you can see for the scale of a child, but you can see that in this case, coloration becomes a way in which you can start to identify new, you know, more edges. So if for a while, you know, the edges somehow disappear, so how you can start to bring them back, you know, framing edges, framing forms, and framing contours. So these are some examples. I mean, through now, more specifically, you see how the work evolves into going from a monochromatic to a plurality of chromaticism that it starts to act very much as a way of adding diversity, even though that sometimes it's just color coding and some other times it's material changes. But that idea that it's almost recognizing that you could work with a kit of parts instead of kind of the unique single system. So I think that the shift, I mean, the three typologies, the swave, which works with a lot of repetition and textures, the eccentric, which works with a lot of individuality and character and independence of the different objects. So instead of one surface engulfing and trying to bridge several conditions, like, many architectures that we've seen that if you have a theater and you also have a housing project, and then you also have maybe a terminal, you engulf them all within a single surface. So how you can start to recognize, not for programmatic reasons, but actually for kind of morphological reasons, you can start to recognize the independent elements. So this is a competition that was just a recent competition that was won by Reiser Umemoto for the Keisung Ferry Port Terminal. And the idea was to start to separate these three parts. If you look at the winning competition by Reiser Umemoto, you will see that there's a negotiation between the three type of program elements, which were towers, plinths for the terminal, and then skylights. So in this case, the towers somehow, the towers become very independent. And each one of them becomes very unique. So there's actually no difference in the three towers in terms of their programs. It's just simply that each one of them becomes quite independent. And then the kind of separation or the actual connection, again, as if you could separate the parts and then just put them together, almost as if it was a toy that you have to assemble. The same thing, these are some of the plans. And these are some of the towers. In this case, also another technique for representation that for me is, it's important in terms of how you can achieve a new kind of materiality, that instead of only relying on the render as your main representational technique, but going back to looking at the model. In this case, there are many photographs of the models. And the model, for me, has some kind of different allure. I mean, it has, even though these projects are not about materiality, but they have, the model gives it a very different texture. I think the render mostly what it gives, when we're working with renders, we try to add different textures, but in the end, it's really a selection of different shaders to create different materialities. But the model, I think, gets a slightly different effect. Also, I learned from that Frank Gehry hates renders, and he shows the projects only through models, so there might be some right on that. The clients understand better the models. The tower, this is a tower, another competition for Taiwan. This was just an ideas competition, but in this case, there's a kind of combination. The tower, as you can see here, is kind of being engulfed by one surface, but then, the kind of what I call the awkwardness of the unbalance of that surface shape starts to take place. So you can see in some of the drawings, the kind of the cutouts start to implement some notion of kind of recognizing the different features, either the openings or the windows. Each one of those big those big arms each one of them is a really large window. So the feature of the large window as part of the form, it's a kind of an important condition to some of the projects. This is another project for prototype for a flower base. And in this case, it was the beginning, you can test it at the scale of a building, or you can test it at the scale of an object, of a smaller object. But in this case, you can really see, like first the kind of family of forms and morphology, and then the recognition of edges and borders, and the kind of separation of the parts. You can separate them and you can put them together. It's part of that, that articulation. So it was really disturbing the other day. I was watching, showing some movies to my daughter, and I saw the Mickey Mouse Club. Looks exactly like this. So I got a little bit worried when I saw that. But anyway, she'll be happy to see this. But anyway, this is literally the Mickey Mouse House for the hot dog song. But the idea in this case, this is a playground. I mean, a playground anyway, so it could be, it was not the source or inspiration at all. It has horrible aesthetics, Mickey Mouse, contemporary Mickey Mouse. But in this case, the idea was that to really play with the notion of the caricature. I mean, you almost see the legs and then you see the different parts. I mean, it really doesn't try to resemble anything that connects to nature or connects to any particular figure. But it actually starts working with certain elements that start to give it character. And the same thing with the landscape. You know, every part, it's a kind of a line that it's emphasized. The last project for the group of the eccentrics was another competition, a recent competition for Los Angeles. And again, I'm not explaining the competitions in terms of their programs or how you could, look at the plan and so on, but really as an exercise of how you start looking at the relationship between the landscape, the objects, and also how you see the morphologies of the different buildings, and you start to question the elements that make, the design elements that build up for those buildings. So the rail LA competition was Union Station, which is the main station, train station in LA is here, and they were bringing the speed rail to LA. So the idea was to bring a park. Instead of just creating some buildings surrounding the rails, but to create a kind of an elevated park on top of those rails. And then the buildings, I mean, the elevated park is very much a contour drawing. I mean, it's a 2D drawing that becomes a series of plates or a series of surfaces. And then the buildings, each one of them has their own character. And some cases related to their particular programs, or some cases they just become iconic. I mean, LA, the downtown LA is really, which is what you see in the back, it's really kind of a mixture of a iconic building, from the Disney Concert Hall to the Caltrain's building and so on. So you can, you do have a kind of separation of each one of them. So same thing would happen in this kind of master plan. So it's the idea of the landscape also is that the landscape at no point tries to merge with the city or merge with the ground. It's like it's a strongly contrasting the background. So the last grouping which is the gang. I think in this case, the idea of the gang has a little bit more to do with still keeping with the notion of repetition, but repetition, like small scale repetition. You have a repetition of 4 to 5 or 6. So almost as if you can count them, how many. The other ones, repetition is countless. That's why it becomes a texture. In this case, it's a gang. I mean, it's a group. I mean, no more than 6 members are allowed. So what is important here is that you can recognize the types. I mean, you can recognize these objects. This is an installation in Los Angeles for LA by Art Gallery. And what it started very much as a kind of a compositional exercise, like how you can recognize different figures or different objects and you can start to combine them. Again, here, literally by tracing the flowers as 2D and then converting them into 3D surfaces, and then composing them into a larger array or a larger system. The idea was that you could name this composition, because you can identify the parts. You don't array them like you would see in the system of the swave, for example, that you need a texture, so that's why the arrangement is more continuous as a gradient. In this case, you can identify them, you can separate them. So I think in the case, the exhibition was called Alice because it had to do with the kind of atmosphere or type of graphic representation of the Lewis Carroll character. So these are some of the elements, these are the parts of the installation where what you can see here is that, again, there's a 3 type of units. There's 3 elements, the large, the medium, and the small. But then the backs of these units have forms that are less genetic. I mean, they are more figural. And they're holding a system that has a lot of repetition. So how you can achieve, how you can combine a system of repetition that has to do with, kind of the production or the fabrication of some of these objects and engage it with a more finite and less genetic system. These are some of the fabrication examples, and all of these, mostly they're kind of soft urethane units that lock into a kind of plug, so almost as a positive and negative system, almost like a Lego piece for each one of the parts. And in this case, what I was saying of the monochromatic, I mean, there's one single color that somehow tries to, some of the other projects where the coloration gives more way to differentiation or separation. In this case, the coloration tries to combine them or tries to connect them. This project came from an earlier investigation from the Schindler House of vertical gardens, where literally the morphology of the flower was kind of, the fake flower was more literal. In this case, this is another competition for Poland, for a Museum of Polish History, where the unit, or again, there's only few of them, almost as if you can count them. The idea was they wanted the project to hover over the freeway, but we put it under the freeway, almost as if to take advantage of that underbelly and the kind of connection to the larger landscape. But the building, the kind of mushrooms or skylights for the museum somehow hover surrounding that freeway. So almost kind of inversing the mass from kind of being really on top of the freeway, but almost growing under the freeway. This is a house in the Bahamas, similar to what was the flower base became a house in a way, with no conflicts. But in this case, each one of them, so the 3 parts of the house, those same elements that in the flower base started to define contours or lines. In this case, it started to define a kind of articulation. At that time, I mean, much of the differentiation or kind of hybridization of coloration from monochromatic to more came from a book by Andy Warhol and Susie Frankfurt, some of the ideas, I say, called Wild Raspberries. And what it's beautiful from that book is that it's mostly their fake recipes written by Andy Warhol's mother. And if you read them, they absolutely make no sense. But the idea is that they kind of combine the recipes with drawings of some of the, some of those things that were represented. And what I found really interesting is that by kind of separating each one of the elements, I mean, you can really recognize, if you just give it one single coloration to any of these, you will lose the kind of attributes of the kind of hybrid morphologies that are taking place. So coloration emphasizes morphology. So what we did for that, for the building in the Bahamas, is we literally just took candy and extracted color patterns out of candies, actual candies, and then moved to using that as a mapping of those surfaces in a very literal way. So the last project, is a project that is currently being exhibited at the Chicago Art Institute until July. And in this case, this project was more specific. I mean, many of the projects, as you see, they stay within the wall. So I'm becoming a wall expert, a wall decorator. So Chef was asking me, why don't you get more jobs as an interior decorator? Because not even that realm goes that far. In the case of the installation for the Chicago Art Institute, the idea was to engage the space. The first option, this is the earlier version of that project where we recognized units, like literally forms that hover within the landscape. And then we created like fake backgrounds. So those objects, I mean, we could only fabricate few elements. The rest are kind of fake shadows or fake paints. So the first iteration was to recognize a center unit or one unit that then would be proliferated throughout the space. But by expanding its contour, it produces an effect, almost a kind of a more three-dimensional effect within the wall with a single landscape. These are also some of the tests what I was talking about, using the model as a representational technique. These are photographs of some of one of the study models where we started to test the kind of that notion of creating kind of two-dimensional layers with a final object that is highly articulated, and it has a huge amount of detail within each one of the parts. So this is the final project. So we moved from that final project to kind of to having less money to build more objects, to have more of a 2D drawing. So what we did is that we expanded the representation of the 2D drawing and in a highly artificial way. So everything you see, almost everything you see is just drawing, painted by a painter at the Art Institute. So it really became like a fresco. So, and not a minor thing, there's a really beautiful text by Sylvia Levin in regard to kissing architecture, in regard to the Pipilotti Risk show at the MoMA, which I was happy to see that is also being exhibited here at the Wexner Center. What it was very interesting is that it starts to give some cachet, let's say, to the notion that if you paint a facade, if you paint a wall, if you create a texture effect on a wall, you can also, it's an interesting departure point for architecture to start looking at the thinner surface of that skin. And again, the Pipilotti Risk, by using projection, it was kind of creating that effect. So in this case, the drawing, these are some images of the drawing. So you can see here that it works very much with some of the conditions that I showed at the beginning about the notion that you start to look at the intersection of forms, so you never have a full form that negotiates, but you're always cutting out of one form. So there's two intersecting geometries, so what I call the circular curve and the spline. And then the black lines, it's a fake shadow effect of that surface. Onto that surface then came all these units that were actually three-dimensional. They really created a kind of three-dimensional effect on the surface. For this project, we end up with this color palette. We studied many color palettes, all the variations that you can imagine of which could be the colors that were used for the surface. And in this case, the contrasting colors of the red, the yellow, and the blue and purple helped in defining that kind of three-dimensional attitude. So these are the actual pictures of the installation as you come through a kind of really long corridor. So this is a gallery that is more than a gallery, it's a circulation corridor. So they converted this into a space where it can be displayed. So as you get closer to the piece, you start to kind of recognize that difference. I mean, the units where you can see them farther away, I mean, those units are not actually trying to merge into the ground, but actually they intend to overlay on the surface. So the notion of the contours, or the notion of, the black line is a very important element in the drawing because it sets up divisions. So the black line always separates colors. The colors don't really mingle as a gradient, or they don't really mingle as a ramp, if you know Maya terms, but they are highly divided by this, the black outline of the drawing. So the units, in the units, it works the same way, almost as if those smaller units are made out of kilo parts. So all this work was painted by a single person. His name is Tony at the Art Institute. So he brought, at the opening, he brought all his family. He was very proud of his fresco. An incredible detail, literally projecting the drawing onto the screen, drawing it by hand. So it's like a mixture between an ancient technique and a kind of contemporary, highly evolved fabrication techniques, because all the units were made with, were milled, and then they were cast in urethane, and then some of the different elements were kind of fabricated and separated. So you can see how the small elements, and also there's certain things that are kind of protruding from the surface, certain small elements that are protruding from the surface. So you can actually recognize the units separated from the ground. And again, this is a gang because there are 8 of them only. If you start counting them, you can see them. And in the centers, they have lights. But the lights were just an effect of getting, or kind of achieving another kind of materiality, which is a kind of a bright coloration. That's the last slide. As I have just realized. And I did exactly 45 minutes. So no more time left.